What if we told you there's a road trip that spans 2 continents, passes through 18 countries, and takes no shorter than 392 hours to complete? You wouldn't need to take any boats or alternate forms of transportation. It would just be you and your car. For some, this may sound like the adventure of a lifetime. For others, their worst nightmare. But what is the longest drivable distance in the world, and where would it start and end? Join us on this journey as we follow the twists and turns of highway systems and roadways around the world to find the longest drivable distance possible. As you'll see, there is one particular route that would literally take you a lifetime to complete. The United States of America has the longest road network in the world, even though it's only the 4th largest landmass. In fact, 1/10 of all roads on our planet are located within the borders of the United States. On the other end of the spectrum are nations that have large amounts of territory composed of impassable geologic features or made up of islands where having extensive road systems just doesn't make sense. For example, the territory of Mauritania in West Africa is covered almost entirely by the Sahara Desert. There are very few people who live in such a climate, therefore it makes little sense to build an extensive highway system throughout the country. Instead, Mauritania has approximately 1 kilometer of road per every 100 square kilometers of land, or 0.62 miles of road for every 38.6 square miles. On the other extreme, there's Macau, an autonomous region of the People's Republic of China that has 1,427 kilometers of road for every 100 square kilometers, or 886.7 miles per every 38.6 square miles. So, not all roads are created equal, and not every country has a road network that would allow you to drive across its lands, which means that we won't be able to go on a road trip across the world that connects every country. So then, the question now becomes, where is the longest single stretch of road that does exist, and how long would it take you to drive it? There are a lot of things to consider for this investigation, so we're going to have to go around the world searching for some of the lengthiest roads, but in the end, the longest drive might be right outside your front door, depending on where you live, of course. Let's start with the one route that many people incorrectly believe to be the longest drivable distance in the world, but that's only true if you cheat. The Pan American Highway extends from Alaska all the way to the tip of South America. It's broken up into different roadways, but the route itself is drivable for almost the entire journey. And if you were to drive the entire distance, you'd pass through frozen tundra, lush tropical rainforests, and arid deserts during your journey. You would pass through 14 countries in total, including Argentina, Chile, Peru, Ecuador, Colombia, Panama, Costa Rica, Nicaragua, Honduras, El Salvador, Guatemala, Mexico, the United States, and Canada. You would also only be able to make the drive during certain times of the year. For instance, in much of Central America, you would need to wait until the dry season to prevent seasonal floods from washing you and your car off the road. Regardless of when you drive through Alaska, there will be ice and snow, so it would be important to have a vehicle that could handle all types of terrain. Let's hypothetically say you were going to drive from Prudhoe Bay, Alaska, south all the way to Ushuaia, Tierra del Fuego Province, Argentina, using the Pan American Highway. You would need to drive down the Alaskan Highway through Fairbanks before crossing into Canada and continuing through the contiguous United States. There are many routes you can take here, so it all depends on what you want to see. Eventually, you'd pass through San Antonio, Texas, and into Mexico. By the time you made it through Central America and reached Panama, you would need to start thinking about how to cross into South America. The problem is that all roads end in Yavisa, Panama, at what is called the Darien Gap. The only way through the rest of Panama and into South America is either by foot through the dense, untamed jungle or by ferry. It's not recommended that you hike through the Darien Gap, as the animals, insects, and daunting terrain can cause serious injury or death, even for the most experienced outdoorsmen. Plus, you can't take your car with you. Instead, you would likely need to load your vehicle onto a boat, take it to Nicoli, Panama, and hop back onto the road to proceed into Colombia. As soon as you take an alternate form of transportation, you technically aren't driving anymore. But if you drove the full distance, the Pan American Highway is approximately 19,000 miles or 30,000 kilometers long and would take an estimated 720 hours or 30 days to get from one end to the other, and that's with no breaks. But since you can't travel the full distance all in one go, that means the Pan American Highway is not the longest drivable distance in the world, and we'll have to leave the New World to find what we're looking for. But this brings up another interesting point. There haven't always been roads, so where did they come from, and how old are these vital transportation networks? Astonishingly, the first paved road that we know of dates back more than 6,000 years ago. In 4000 BCE, stones were laid in Mesopotamia, which is now modern-day Iraq, to create road networks to move goods and military forces. Archaeologists have found the remnants of these infrastructure projects at ancient cities such as Ur and Babylon. Around this time, the Sumerians were also using the first asphalt to cement bricks into place to create structures and temples. This type of substance wouldn't be used by Europeans or the United States for road construction for thousands and thousands of years. In Glastonbury, England, old roads have been found leading to Glastonbury Abbey, where devout Christians would make pilgrimages yearly. It's hypothesized that traffic caused by the huge number of people coming to visit the abbey resulted in the creation of roadways prior to 1000 CE. In the late 1700s, Thomas Telford and John Loudon McAdam created the first modern roads, with a slight rise in the center that allowed for easy water drainage. McAdam played an integral role in using tightly packed stones covered with gravel. This idea eventually led to a bitumen-based binding called tarmacadam, which was the first tar substance. It was laid on the roads of Paris, and in 1824 the Champs-Élysées was covered in asphalt, making it the first modern road in Europe. Only a couple of decades later, the United States would begin paving its own roads. This would be the start of the roadway infrastructure that spans the country today. Unsurprisingly, one of the first roads to be paved in the US was Pennsylvania Avenue in Washington, D.C., right outside of the White House. Now the practice of using asphalt concrete is common around the world. Pothole-filled dirt roads are being covered into smooth paved roads. Whether this is for better or for worse can be debated. But if you are a road trip lover, you can thank the Mesopotamians for inventing the first roads. But as we said, the longest roads aren't found in North America. So we'll have to look elsewhere in order to determine which route would take you the furthest. It may seem counterproductive to head to the smallest continent on Earth to search for the longest drive, but stay with us. Highway 1 in Australia, also known as the Big Lap, is the world's longest drivable ring and provides an intriguing opportunity for drivers. What is interesting about this route is that you never have to get out of your car except to refuel and use the facilities. You could literally go around and around and around Australia for the rest of your life on the Big Lap if you wanted to. This highway connects all but 2 state capitals in Australia. You would drive through Perth in Western Australia, Darwin in the Northern Territories, Brisbane in Queensland, Sydney in New South Wales, Melbourne in Victoria, and Adelaide in South Australia. Your reward for completing the Big Lap would be to travel a distance of 8,834 miles, or 14,217 kilometers. So you'd have to do 3 laps to equal the entirety of the Pan American Highway. But at least you can do it without changing vehicles. And it's still a huge roadway even if you only were to do a single lap, since if it were to be stretched out, it could stretch across the United States nearly 3 times. But since we are looking for the furthest drivable distance and not the longest drivable loop, we need to continue our journey to other roads around the world. Before we leave Australia, though, it is worth noting that the record for completing the Big Lap is held by a man named Jay Gordon and the 3 members of his team. Together, they drove a newly purchased 2017 Toyota Land Cruiser Sahara for 5 days, 13 hours, and 43 minutes and used 2,284 liters or 603 gallons of diesel, averaging 2,600 kilometers or 1,615 miles per day. Each driver took a 6-hour shift, and the car was only turned off for refueling and once for a live stream. There is another completely different Highway 1 that's incredibly long too. This one runs through Asia and is the longest road route through the entire continent. Although the path technically ends in Japan, a ferry is needed to complete this leg of the journey, so it doesn't count toward the drivable distance traveled, so its easternmost terminus on the Asian continent is actually Busan, South Korea, and it extends all the way to Istanbul, Turkey, to the west. However, Asian Highway 1 is not a direct route straight across the continent. Instead, it loops around the southern edge of Asia and proceeds west, passing through South Korea, North Korea, China, Hong Kong, Vietnam, Cambodia, Thailand, Myanmar, Bangladesh, India, Pakistan, Afghanistan, Iran, and Turkey. The trip would take you around 125 hours or just over 5 days to get from end to end. However, since you'll need to stop for multiple border crossings, the drive will take much longer. Also, Asian Highway 1 passes through several countries that are not the safest to travel through. You would need to make your way through North Korea, where Kim Jong-un's regime can pose a serious risk to foreigners, especially those who come from the West. Then there's Afghanistan, which is once again ruled by the Taliban, and Iran, which doesn't always have the best track record for allowing people to leave their borders once inside. The entirety of Asia Highway 1 is 12,774 miles, or 20,557 kilometers, and it would be the longest drivable distance in the world if it weren't for some impassable sections that still need to be connected. The ferry from Japan to mainland, and the inability of most people to drive through North Korea. Therefore, we can't in good conscience count Asian Highway 1 as the longest drivable distance at this time. But in the future, who knows? It should come as no surprise that the longest highway that goes across a single country is found in Russia. The Trans-Siberian Highway extends from the major port city of Vladivostok in the east to St. Petersburg in the west. Driving through Russia is not easy. Much of the country consists of frozen, inhospitable land that creates treacherous driving conditions. Then there's the fact that Vladimir Putin is still in charge, and it's probably best to stay out of the country while it's waging war against Ukraine. The Trans-Siberian Highway takes drivers from the Sea of Japan to the Baltic Sea and could take around 14 days to complete if you're driving cautiously to avoid skidding off the road. The highway itself is about 6,000 miles or 9,660 kilometers long. However, even though it may not be as long as some other routes, it is actually part of what will become the longest drivable distance in the world. However, after we examine this route, we will look at a more recent series of roads that could actually take the top spot. As it stands today though, the furthest you could drive without needing to board any trains, planes, or ferries until relatively recently was a route from Sagres, Portugal, all the way to Tallinn, Russia, located in the Magadan Oblast. It is important to note that some of the roads in northeastern Russia are little more than dirt paths. However, you could theoretically make your way from Tallinn westward through the enormous territory that is Russia and then cross through Belarus, before going through Poland, Germany, Belgium, France, Spain, and then finally end in Portugal. This route is 9,416 miles or 15,154 kilometers long. It crosses 2 continents, and the estimated drive time for such a journey would be around 200 hours or over 8 days of non-stop driving. Obviously, that would be the best-case scenario if nothing went wrong and you didn't encounter inclement weather, which would add days, if not weeks, or even longer to your journey. And that's not even factoring in the other dangers that might plague your trip, like international conflicts as you drive adjacent to active war zones. Hang on though. There's still one route that is even potentially longer than this one. For our purposes, we're going to assume the world is at peace and you can make your trip safely, but no matter the state of international affairs, all roads can still be dangerous, and they definitely weren't always as safe as they are today. There are still plenty of accidents, and the CDC calculates there are roughly 1.35 million people killed on roadways around the world each year. That is almost 3,700 deaths a day. But as cars become safer and infrastructure is updated, hopefully this number will go down. One key component of road safety is the lines that divide the different sides of a street. Surprisingly, this is a relatively new concept in some parts of the world. Even in the United States, during the early 1900s, roads and highways didn't have any lines drawn on them. The craziest part is road lines actually came from spilled milk. Prior to road lines, drivers were just expected to stay on their side of the street and hug the right side of the roadway. Then, in 1911, Edward Hines noticed that a large number of accidents were happening around curves as drivers tended to drift into the opposite lane. Heinz had been inspired to create white lines in the middle of the road to distinguish between the two sides when he saw milk spilling from a delivery truck on a newly paved road. The spilled milk left white dashes in the middle of the asphalt, which Heinz decided could be created just as easily with white paint. In 1935, the US government gave local officials the option to paint center lines in either yellow, black, or white, depending on the color of the pavement. As of 1955, every state except Oregon adopted white lines as the center of roads. The Oregon government argued that the yellow lines were safer. However, rather than listening to the Oregonians' concern, the federal government threatened to withhold $300 million in highway funds unless they changed the color of their lines. Oregon gave in and used the federal standard white line. Ironically, less than 20 years later, in 1971, the federal government mandated that all center lines be painted yellow with white stripes and used for multiple lanes moving in the same direction. There is no universal standard for road safety around the world, but typically green means go, red means stop, and you should always stay on your side of the street. The development of paved roadways has allowed people to travel vast distances in automobiles. Technically, dirt roads do count towards the longest drivable distance on the planet, but it is these stretches that are incredibly uncomfortable and cause your car's shock absorbers to work overtime to keep the vehicle stable. It's likely that more and more parts of the world will be connected by roads in the future. However, this might not be such a good thing. Hopefully, by the time we can drive around the world via newly completed road networks, cars will be much more efficient, and the longest drivable distance on the planet will be smooth riding. But now let's look at a more recent route that would put the previously held longest drivable distance on the planet to shame, and truly the absolute longest drivable distance in the world. Buckle up, because here we go. For the longest possible drive, you would start in the Maginot-Alden Sakha Republic, Russia, and head south. You would eventually make it to Turi Rog, which is located on the Russian-China border near Lake Khanka. The reason you can't start further north in Russia is because the only way to get across the Aldan River is by ferry, and that would be cheating. But if there were a bridge there, then after crossing into China, you could drive along the Pacific coast all the way to Nanning. You would then continue to follow the coast through Vietnam, Cambodia, and Thailand, then into Myanmar, and across the border to India, where you would drive around the entire subcontinent to the Pakistan border in the west. From here, you would cross into Pakistan, drive along the Arabian Sea, pass through Iran, Iraq, into Jordan, and drive through the southern tip of Israel. Once you were about to hit the Gulf of Aqaba, you'd continue west along Route 50 until you reach the Suez Canal, where you would drive under the waterway via the Ahmed Handi Tunnel. At this point, you would have crossed into Africa, the second largest continent on the planet. The challenge now is to find a roadway that'll take you from North Africa all the way to the very tip of South Africa. In order to do this, you would need to drive along the Mediterranean Sea in Egypt via Highway 40, pass into Libya through Tunisia and Algeria, continue into Morocco, pass by Casablanca, and then head south into Western Sahara. Once through Western Sahara, you'd follow the Atlantic coast into Mauritania. Next, you'd drive through Senegal, pass the easternmost border of the Gambia, and proceed through Conakry, Guinea. Then you'd cut east to Côte d'Ivoire. You would follow the coast along the Gulf of Guinea through Ghana, Togo, and Benin. The route would then proceed through Cameroon, the Republic of Congo, a small sliver of the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and into Angola. You would continue to drive south through Nambia and cross into South Africa, where you would connect to Route 7, which would bring you all the way to Cape Town. At the southernmost tip of the country, you would find Simonstown, cradled next to Table Mountain National Park. This would be a tremendous journey. It would be over 29,976 miles, or 43,413 kilometers in length. The expedition would take you around 617 hours, or over 25 and a half days of just driving to complete, and you would pass through 32 different countries. Again, some parts of the drive would be treacherous, and you'd be traveling through some politically unstable nations, starting with Russia. But this route would be the longest possible drive in the world, where you wouldn't have to use any alternate forms of transportation. But that being said, if you could take 2 boats, then theoretically, you could drive across 5 different continents. If you were to start in Ushuaia, Tierra del Fuego province, Argentina, travel north all the way to Panama, where you take a ferry across the Darien Gap and continue north all the way to Alaska, you could then charter a ship to carry you and your car across the Bering Strait. You could be dropped off in eastern Russia, where you would be able to drive all the way to Portugal, cut back, and then proceed south to the tip of South Africa. This would be a long and very expensive journey, but with just 2 ferries, it would be possible to drive to 5 out of the 7 continents on the planet. The driving distance for this excursion would be well over 46,000 miles or 74,000 kilometers. It would take months to complete, but in the end, you would say you've driven the longest possible distance around the world. However, this is where things get really interesting. You've probably driven well over 46,000 miles in your lifetime, which means you have driven farther than it would take to travel across 5 continents. The routes we've been talking about in this video are the longest contiguous, non-repeating drivable distances in the world. If you were to drive around the 8,834 miles or 14,217 kilometers of the Big Lap over and over and over again, you could drive hundreds of thousands or even millions of miles during your lifetime. It's estimated that people living in the United States drive 13,500 miles or 21,726 kilometers per year. This means from the time they're 16 and can get a driver's license to when they're 80 and probably shouldn't be behind the wheel anymore, the average American drives about 864,000 miles or 1,390,473 kilometers. Obviously, this is only possible because they drive the same route over and over and over again. However, what if you were to drive every road in the world? How far would you have to drive to pass through every intersection and go down every dead-end street? Buckle up, because things are about to get absurd. If you bought a brand new car and set out to drive every road in the entire world, you simply wouldn't make it. There are an estimated 40 million miles or 64.4 million kilometers of roads on the planet. If you were to drive 60 miles per hour, which you wouldn't be able to do for most roads, and never stop driving, it would take you 666,667 hours to drive along them all. That's 27,778 days, or 76 years. Since you wouldn't be able to start driving until you were 16, you would be no younger than 92 by the time you finished. Needless to say, it's not possible for you or your car. The average car can last for around 200,000 miles or 321,870 kilometers if it's properly maintained. Using this statistic, you would go through approximately 200 cars and 615 sets of tires before you finished driving over every road in the world. And even if you somehow managed to complete this driving journey, you'd have to go back and do it all again as new roads are being built all the time. In the United States alone, there are around 6,500 miles or 10,461 kilometers of new roads built every year. So the longest drivable distance in the world is always changing as new roads are built and previous roads are connected. Perhaps in the future, you will actually be able to drive from Alaska to the tip of South America using the Pan-American Highway without taking a ferry. Or if someday a bridge is built over the Bering Strait, which has been proposed several different times, you will be able to drive from the Americas into Asia, at which point you can drive to both Africa and Europe as well. Australia, Oceania, and Antarctica will never be connected to the other continents via a roadway due to the vast swaths of ocean between them. It's also interesting to note that Antarctica is the only continent in the world that has no paved roads. Cars have been a major part of daily life for many people. On average, Americans drive more frequently and further than any other population in the world. The average car releases approximately 400 grams of carbon dioxide per mile into the atmosphere. This means that car drivers contribute around 350 million grams or 771,600 pounds of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere during their lifetime. This is an enormous amount of greenhouse gas emissions, and since there are approximately 1.45 billion vehicles on the planet, this number is alarming. Just because you could go on a 26,976 mile or 43,413 kilometer road trip through Asia and Africa doesn't necessarily mean you should. Car technology has advanced tremendously over the past decade, and vehicles are becoming much more fuel efficient. There's also a plethora of electric vehicle options now. However, until the charging infrastructure around the world becomes more widespread and accessible, no one will be making any of the drives in this video using an electric car anytime soon. Now, to have more of your geography and history questions answered, be sure to go to watch The Real Reason the United States Bought Alaska from Russia, or check out Why There Is No Bridge Between Europe and Africa.